So I guess we could just jump right in because introductions introductions may distract. But I just want to give one point. I want to give. Well, I think the best way to do this is if every week I give the sort of the outline of the chapter, what the chapter is trying to do, and after that we'll read it inside as much as we can cover of the actual chapter. So just to get, especially the first chapter, the first page of the first chapter can get very technical because it's doing is it's quoting many rabbinic and Talmudic sources. The first page. That's actually the meaning of the word Tanya. Tanya is a word, it's just the first word of the book. That's why I got the name. The author did not call it Tanya. But 1 second, Tanya means we have learned. So in the Talmud, when the sages of the Talmud quote the sages of the Mishnah, they say, Tanya, we learned, right? So we learned. So it's a quote from the Talmud, and that's where the name gets its book from. That's how we call the name Tanya. The author, we read last week, I don't know if we emphasized it enough, but last week the author called it Sefer Shel Beinonim, the book of the intermediary. In other words, Beinoni is sort of in between. And that comes from a term that is also quoted in the Talmud, that's in the Talmud, quoted on the first page of the Talmud, and we're going to discuss that. And that's the figure of that's sort of the person that the book focuses on. But let's get to the big picture. What's really happening here? So we look at Talmudic sources and we see that there's three categories of people. There's a tzaddik, there's a righteous person, and there is a rasha, a wicked person, and there's also something called Beinoni, someone's in between. I'm not righteous, I'm not wicked, I'm in between. And these terms exist in the Talmud. The question is, of course, what is the definition of these terms? And the conventional definition is, if a person has a majority of good deeds, he's righteous. If a person has a majority of bad deeds, he's wicked. And if a person is 50-50, he's intermediary, he's in between. And that's a very comfortable definition. The problem with this definition is that it doesn't stand up to the scrutiny in the Talmudic sources. And that's what Rabbi Shneur Zalman is going to deal with, that he basically says it doesn't really work that way. You can't really explain it that way, because if you look carefully at Talmudic sources, it turns out that even if I have one sin, I am wicked. If I then repent, I become righteous. So what's the in-between? How could I be in between? One sin doesn't make me in between. 50% sins doesn't make me in between. I'm either in a state of righteousness or I'm in a state of wickedness. If I sin, I'm even one sin, I'm wicked. If I repent, I'm righteous. It's simple. So where do you have this in-between state? So this is the problem from Talmudic sources. This problem forces Rabbi Shneur Zalman to reach the conclusion that even if a person is going to be majority of good deeds, he's not righteous. He's wicked. I'm sorry, he could be wicked if he sins. So now we have to understand what is the intermediary state. So what does that lead to us? What does that do for us? What's the in-between state? So what does that do for us? What that does for us is it can now lead us to a much deeper definition of those terms, righteous, wicked, and intermediary. And we're going to say this has nothing to do with what you do, how you act, which was the conventional interpretation. Most good deeds, you're righteous. Most evil, if you have a majority of good deeds, you're righteous. If you have a majority of evil deeds, you're wicked. And if you're in between, 50-50, you're in between. But that does not stand up to the test of the scrutiny within the Talmudic sources. Like I said, one bad deed, I'm wicked. If I repent, I'm righteous. So what is in between? So that forces us to shift away and understand that these terms have nothing to do with what I do. What are these terms? These terms are talking about the state of my soul. It's a much deeper internal definition. So now this opens up an entire an entire world of analysis, and to say that if I really want to understand the definitions of these terms, righteous, wicked, or intermediary, I have to look not at what I do, I have to look at the state of my soul. What's my inner life look? What does my inner life look like? And that's sort of the first page of the first chapter. And then the second page of the chapter really starts to introduce this concept, and it puts down it drops a bomb. And this bomb is really one of the big ideas. And the big ideas is, if you look at Talmudic sources, we understand there's not one person, there are two people. There's not one soul, there are two souls. And understanding the relationship between these two souls will help us understand what it means how do we define the terms righteous, wicked, or intermediary. And the next 12 chapters discuss these souls. What are the two souls? First of all, what is a soul? What are the two souls? What are the tools the souls have? What do the souls want? How they conflict with each other? And how to manage these two souls. So that's a very big idea, because that gives us insight to what's happening within ourselves. But what I'm trying to say is that the beginning, the question, what looked like a technicality to figure out what is a definition of the intermediary spot, that is not just, I'm curious to think what the Talmud means. That really forces us to dig deeper and say, to the definition of righteous, definition of wicked, is not just in the external, in the realm of action, but it actually forces us to look internal and say, what's happening within ourselves? Because the old definition of it follows the action, majority good, righteous, majority wicked, majority bad deeds, wicked, and intermediary, 50-50, that doesn't stand up to the test of scrutiny. Doesn't stand up to what Talmud itself says, as we will see. So what does that do? It must be there's an inner world. It must be these are definitions of inner terms of what happens within the person, him or herself. And now we could start the journey of the two souls. And I think for the next at least 12 chapters, we have a description, a description of what the soul is, what are the terms of the soul, what are the tools the soul possesses, and how those souls interact with each other and with the person and with the person's consciousness. So I think this is, by way of introduction, laying out what the first chapter of Tanya is about to do, and hopefully we can cover most of it all of it today, this morning right here. So we're going to begin. As always, comments and questions, no need to wait to the end. You just jump in and don't be shy. Okay, I figured we're going to use not what we used last week, but we're going to use the lessons in Tanya, which is a little bit more elaborate. I guess it's more pretty to the eyes, so we'll use that. And share the screen. I'm going to share the link. If anybody wants the link for later, you can always find it. Lessons in TanyaChabad.org. Very simple find, chapter 1. You can find the chat box. Chat. Here we go. Okay. So what do we start with? We start with a few technical questions, and we're going to get back to them. You see, you have to keep track of this book. We're going to ask a series of questions. The questions begin to be answered only in chapter 13. Okay, the questions that we start with, because before we can figure out how to answer these questions, we have to lay out the definitions, and that takes us at least 12 chapters. Okay, so we have learned, Tanya, this is Tractate Nida, the Tractate in the Talmud, the final Tractate in the Talmud. So what does the Talmud say? An oath is administered to him, be righteous and be not wicked. And even if the whole world judging you by your actions tells you that you are righteous, regard yourself as wicked. Okay, so what does this verse say? This verse says like this, this teaching says like this: before the soul enters the body, in heaven, they make the soul take an oath. What's the oath? The oath is, be righteous, don't be wicked. That's clause number 1 of the oath. Clause number 2 of the oath is, even if everybody tells you that you're righteous, consider yourself to be wicked. So be righteous, don't be wicked, but consider yourself wicked. Okay, what's the purpose of the oath? Why an oath will help? We'll deal with that later if we have time. So we have a few questions. First of all, this calls for an explanation. For we have learned in the Mishnah, be not wicked in your own estimation. So the first thing, we have a contradiction. Talmud and Nida, Tractate Nida says, even if everybody tells you you're righteous, consider yourself as wicked. Okay, consider yourself wicked. Then you have another Talmudic teaching in Tractate Avot, in the Ethics of the Fathers, which says, don't consider yourself as wicked. So what should I do? Should I consider myself wicked or not? So that's one question from the contradiction. But then we have another question. In other words, logic. Logic dictates that considering oneself wicked is not a good idea. Furthermore, if a person considers himself wicked, he will be grieved at heart and depressed, and consequently will not be able to serve God joyfully and with a contented heart, which is one of the commandments. You have to serve God joyfully. So on one hand, I have to be joyous. If I'm gonna consider myself wicked, I'm not going to be joyous. While if his heart will not at all be grieved by this self-appraisal, he may be led to irreverence, God forbid, by such an attitude, with sin protruding him not at all. So now we're in a catch-22. If I consider myself wicked, if I'm sad that I'm wicked, I can't serve God with joy. If the fact that I'm wicked doesn't bother me, that itself is a problem. How could it not bother me that I'm not wicked? How could it not bother me that I'm wicked? So this concept that the Talmud says that they give the soul an oath and they say, be righteous, but consider yourself wicked, we don't understand. What does it mean, consider yourself wicked? What's the problem? Number one, there's a contradiction. In other places it says, don't consider yourself wicked. Number two, what would be the benefit of considering myself wicked? Okay, so that's the questions. Now we start introducing the idea that the Talmud itself gives many definitions of the status of people, and we want to figure out, what does this mean? However, the above matter will be more clearly understood after a preliminary discussion of the true meaning of righteous and wicked. We find in the Gemara 5 distinct types. A righteous man who is prosperous, materially as well as spiritually. He knows only good. Literally in the Hebrew, a tzaddik, a righteous person, that it is good for him. A righteous man who suffers in both material as well as spiritual sense. Spiritually has not yet vanquished all his evil, and in the material sense too, he is wanting. So in other words, we have a tzaddik that is good for him, a tzaddik that is bad for him. Tzaddik is a righteous person. We have a wicked man in whom there is some good, and who prospers. A wicked man who suffers spiritually and materially, and an intermediate man, the Beinoni. So we have 5 definitions. Talmud continues. The Gemara explains. The righteous man who prospers is the consummate, literally complete tzaddik, the complete tzaddik. The righteous man who suffers is the imperfect, literally incomplete tzaddik. So in other words, the Talmud itself gives us definitions. A tzaddik that it is good for him is complete tzaddik. A tzaddik that it is bad for him is an incomplete tzaddik. So what do we have? We have a tzaddik, a righteous person. Within the righteous person, there are two categories, complete or incomplete. And the same would be for the wicked, by the way. And in the Raya Mehemna, Parshas Mishpatim, which is the Zohar, it is explained that the righteous man who suffers is one whose evil nature is subservient to his good nature. Okay, so what does it mean? Tzaddik v'ra'alei, tzaddik that's bad for him. Tzaddik that's bad for him means he's got some bad, but the good within him dominates. Okay, fine.
Rabbi, can I ask you a quick question?
Yes, please.
The tzaddik that suffers, does he suffer because of internal reasons or external reasons?
So the Talmud seems to be saying that it's related. The Talmud seems to be saying it's related. A tzaddik that's bad for him is because he's incomplete. Incomplete tzaddik. Incomplete righteous person, meaning there's some bad within him. So again,
that means that if tzaddik is suffering for external reasons, it means there is something wrong with him because he doesn't process the internal difficulties properly.
The answer is in some cases, yes. In other words, not always is this true. Not always does a person suffer. Does it indicate that he's not righteous? Sometimes the righteous people suffer, right?
Well, I would argue that Rabbi Akiva, when he was executed, he suffered somewhat.
Correct. So it's not always true that if I suffer, it's because I'm not righteous. That's not always true. But what we're saying here is that there is a tzaddik we say is V'ra loy is bad for him. Sometimes there's a tzaddik that it's bad for him. And that means, and that's because he's incomplete. Not always, but sometimes. In other words, it doesn't have to be that way, but there is a class of people that are righteous, but the righteousness is incomplete. And that's why they would suffer, because their righteousness is incomplete. Assuming that the reason why they're suffering is because of their righteousness. But sometimes a person suffers for external reasons, because it's divine plan or whatever else it may be. So it doesn't have to mean that every single time someone suffers, it means they're in complete righteousness. Now, what we're trying to get from this discussion is something different. We're not really going into this. What we're trying to get to is that there is different two categories within the righteous person, and how those categories are really not just telling you what the state of in the world, whether they're suffering or not, but it represents their internal life. In the Gemara, in the end of chapter 9 of Brachot, it is stated that the righteous are judged, i.e. motivated and ruled by their good nature having the final say. The wicked are judged, i.e. motivated and ruled by their evil nature having the final say. Intermediate men are judged by both the good and evil nature. Okay, now we're making some progress, because here we're starting to get a little bit of insight of what this intermediate person is. So we say, if you're righteous, it's because you have a good inclination judging you. In other words, your good inclination is in charge. If you're wicked, it's your evil inclination is in charge. If I'm intermediate, I have both of them are in charge. Okay, wonderful. So this is sort of a digest of the Talmudic sources, some of the Talmudic sources that tell us that there are multiple categories, five categories: righteous, wicked, and in between. And there are two categories within the righteous, and there are two categories within the wicked. Okay, now we have a strange story. What is the story? It's just a saying. Amar Rabba. Rabba declared. Rabba is one of the greatest Talmudic sages. I, for example, am a Beinoni. Rabba, the greatest sage of his time, says, "Don't think I'm wicked. I'm righteous. I'm in the middle. I'm an intermediate man." Said Abaya to him. Abaya, who was also a great Talmudic sage, says, "Master, you make it impossible for any creature to live. If you're an intermediary, we're all wicked. It's impossible." So the student says, "You're not intermediary. You are righteous." But the master insists, "No, I'm intermediary. I'm not righteous." To understand all the aforesaid clearly, an explanation is called for. What's the real problem? Okay. And also to understand the statement of Job in Baba Batra, "Lord of the universe, you have created righteous men, you have created wicked men, for he does not decree which persons are to be righteous or wicked." Another problem is Job says, "God, you made righteous people, you made wicked people," but the Talmud says in that same opening statement of Tractate Nida that they make the soul swear. The Talmud says that before the soul is born, they declare in heaven what the destiny of that soul is, whether they'll be smart or foolish, whether they'll be rich or poor, but it does not say whether you'll be righteous or wicked, because that's in the free choice of the human being. Okay, so we'll deal with that in a minute. Here's the big question. We must also understand the essential nature, the mahut, which is Hebrew for the essence, of the rank of the Beinoni. This is what we're trying to get to. Remember, this is the book of the intermediary person. It's not a book for righteous people. There are very few righteous people by this definition. This is for the average person. This is a book for, not average is a bad word. This is for the intermediary person. That's what we want to really understand. What is this intermediary stage? And this is what I said earlier. The conventional interpretation, it does not stand to scrutiny. He is certainly not one whose deeds are half virtuous and half sinful. For if this were so, how could Rabbah err in classifying himself as a Beinoni, when it is known that his mouth never ceased studying the Torah, so much so that even the angel of death had no dominion over him? The angel of death could only harm the person when they're not connected to God. So there's all kinds of medrashim of stories how, for example, King David, how when he died, the medrash says that he was studying the entire time. He couldn't die, so the angel of death made a commotion. He went outside. He walked down the stairs. He walked down the ladder, and the stair broke, and he stopped studying. And that moment, he was killed. In that moment, his soul passed. What we see from here, Rabbah did not have 50% sins. Rabbah never stopped studying Torah. Rabbah says, I am an intermediary. Whoa, if Rabbah is an intermediary, there goes our definition. If Rabbah could consider himself intermediary, there goes our definition of righteous majority good deeds, wicked majority bad deeds, and intermediary 50-50. No, Rabbah did not have 50% sins. How then could he err in considering that he was that his deeds were half his deeds were sinful? God forbid. So that's one problem, the story of Rabbah. Now we're going to go at another story, at other sources, and we're going to show that even if somebody commits one sin, even if it's not a biblical sin, it's a rabbinic sin. Even one sin makes me wicked. If I repent, I'm righteous. But there's no such thing as 50-50. I can't be 50-50. I can't be 50% evil and call myself intermediary. One sin makes me wicked. How? So furthermore, when can a person be considered a Beinoni? For at the time one sins until he repents, he is deemed completely wicked. And if he was sinful and then repented, thus ceasing to be wicked, he is deemed completely righteous. Even he who violates a minor prohibition of the rabbis is termed wicked, as it is stated in Yevamos chapter 2 and Nida chapter 1. Moreover, even he who himself does not sin, but has the opportunity to forewarn another against sinning, and fails to do so, is termed wicked in Shavuot chapter 6. And the more so, he who neglects any positive law which he is able to fulfill. For instance, whoever is able to study Torah and does not do so. To him our sages have applied the verse, because he has despised the word of the Lord, i.e. the Torah, the soul shall be utterly cut off. In other words, the sages say the person has an opportunity to study Torah and does not, he's despising the word of the Lord. It is thus plain that such a person is called wicked, more so than he who violates a prohibition of the sages. This being so, we must conclude, and this is the key. This being so, we must conclude that the Beinoni, the intermediary person, is not guilty even of the sin of neglecting of studies Torah, which is very hard to do, of course. That is why Rabbah mistook himself for a Beinoni. Okay, we're going to skip the comments. So let's sum up what we're saying so far. What we're saying so far is the conventional interpretation of the definitions of the human condition, righteous, wicked, and intermediary, which are the conventional interpretation, which we'll deal with in a minute. Rabbi Shneur Zalman quotes how this conventional interpretation came about. But the conventional interpretation does not really stand up to scrutiny. Conventional interpretation is righteous, most sins, means I have a majority of good deeds. Wicked means I have a majority of bad deeds. And intermediary means I have 50-50. That does not stand up to scrutiny. Why? For multiple reasons. First of all, if so, Rabbah, the greatest sage of his time, who never stopped studying even for one moment, would not be able, even if he's a great humble person, he cannot say, I have 50% sins. It's impossible. One problem. Another big problem is you quote the Talmudic sources and you will see that even one sin makes the person wicked. You repent, you can have all the sins in the world. You repent, automatically you're righteous. You're not in between, right? The joke is that the guy says, I'm very loyal to my spouse. I'm just not loyal once a year. If you're not loyal once a year, you're not loyal. There's no such thing as, what's this in between? Are you loyal? Well, I'm in between. Once a year, I'm disloyal. It doesn't work that way. Either you're loyal, or you sin, I'm wicked. And if I repent, now I can do all, or if I repent, I'm righteous again. But what does this mean, 50-50? That definition doesn't hold. So now we go back to the Tanya, and we'll see that, there is a term. As for the well-known saying that one whose deeds are misdeeds are equally balanced is called a Beinoni, while he who has a majority of virtues outweighing his sins is called a tzaddik. This is only a borrowed term, i.e. a figurative use of the term borrowed from its true usage in order to emphasize a particular point. Thus, the name Beinoni and tzaddik denotes a balance between merits and sins, are in fact but borrowed names, used in regard to reward and punishment, because one is judged according to the majority of his deeds. And he is termed righteous in reference to his verdict, since he is acquitted at the trial. If, however, we seek to truly define, okay, what are we saying so far? We're saying so far as follows. We're saying that, yes, you open up the Talmud, it's going to tell you, you're going to find some definitions whereby intermediary means 50% sins and 50% right of good deeds, and a righteous means mostly good deeds. Says Rabbi Shneur Zalman, yes, that's a wonderful definition, but it's not the real term. It's not really what a tzaddik means. It's not really what a wicked person means or a righteous person or intermediary. It's a borrowed term. When you talk about the judgment, what do I mean by the judgment? The judgment is, the Talmud says, how the divine judgment judges the person, and you're righteous in the verdict if you have 50% sins. I'm sorry, if you have majority mitzvot, majority good deeds. Then you're righteous in the verdict. Then the verdict is on your favor. But that's not the true definition. That's only a borrowed term for the verdict. But you want to know the true definition? True definition, righteous person has no sins. And a wicked person has no sins. Like I said, a wicked person has even one sin. A wicked person can have all the sins, but if they repent, they become righteous automatically. So what is this doing for us? Well, this is forcing us to say that the terms righteous, wicked, and intermediary cannot be based on what I do. Because if they're based on what I do, then this makes no sense, and there's no intermediary. So it must be that it's not what I do, but it's the state of my inner soul. It's a state of my being. It's a state of my feeling. It's a state of what's happening within myself, not what I do. Oh, so this is now going to open a whole new avenue of discussion of definition of terms and basically turning the light inward, turning the focus inward on the state of my soul. Okay, let's read what a righteous person is, and then you'll see why this book is not for the righteous people, because most people are not righteous. By the definition of a Tanya, we're not righteous, and therefore, we're not talking about the righteous person. So let's get the righteous person out of the way. If, however, we seek to truly define the distinct qualities and ranks of tzaddikim and beinonim, tzaddikim is righteous and beinonim is intermediary, our sages have remarked that the righteous are judged, i.e. motivated and ruled solely by their good nature, as it is written, and my heart is void within me, meaning that he, i.e. David, the author of the verse, was devoid of an evil nature, having slain it through fasting. After King David sinned with Bathsheba, he was fasting, he did teshuvah, and he gets to the point and he says, Libi chalal b'kirbi, my soul is hollow or void within me. I have a void within my soul. And the sages say, you know what? It means he has no more evil inclination. He has no evil inclination. Only the good inclination directs him. He's got no evil inclination. Why? Because he's killed his evil inclination. There's no more evil inclination. So if this is a book, if you have no evil inclination, you're buying the wrong book. Go find another book. Because by this definition, tzaddik is somebody who has no evil inclination, which we're going to say that's few and far between. Maybe 1 in a million, maybe less. But whoever has not attained this degree of ridding himself of his evil nature, even though his virtues outnumber his sins, he is not at all of the level and rank of tzaddik. This is why our sages have expounded. The Almighty saw that the righteous were few, so he arose and planted, i.e. spread them in every generation. For as it is written, the tzaddik is the foundation of the world. Sometimes you have the foundation of the world, one tzaddik, not righteous people in the plural, but a righteous person. In other words, there's very few righteous souls scattered throughout the generations where a person has no desire for sin, no evil inclination. That is the definition of tzaddik based on the Tanya. So that's the first half of the first chapter. And now I just want to close the screen, make a quick summary. If anyone has any comments, please share. And then we begin to dig in. What are we saying here? We're saying conventionally, the conventional interpretation is very simple. If I have a majority good deeds, I'm righteous. If I have majority bad deeds, I'm evil. If I'm 50-50, I'm in between. We say that cannot be the definition. That definition is gone, as we just proved from the Talmudic sources. So what is the new definition? New definition is a righteous person has no evil inclination. He doesn't want to do bad. That's a righteous person. By the way, don't try to be a righteous person. Maybe you could try. We'll see whether or not you should try that. We'll see that later. But most people, vast majority of the people are not. There's precious few souls that are righteous. Okay. Now we can figure out, so what's the intermediary and what's the wicked? And like I said, we already have the hint because the book is called the book for the intermediary people. So if Rabbi Shneur Zalman wrote a book for tzaddikim, a book for righteous people, by the conventional definition of righteous people, everybody's righteous. I mean, most people are righteous. They do majority of good deeds. But by the Tanya's definition of righteous people, you make a book for righteous people, you're not going to be able to sell because there are very few righteous people. The students of Rabbi Shneur Zalman, who were mostly non-Hasidic and they came Hasidic, they said like this. They said, before we studied Tanya, we thought we're all righteous. After we study Tanya, you say, Halavai, we wish we would be Beinoni, be intermediary. In other words, even being an intermediary is a great accomplishment, as we will see. But again, it's not just technical. It's not just the technical how to classify myself. Am I classifying myself as righteous, or am I classifying myself as intermediary? That's not the big idea. The big idea here is that these definitions of righteous, intermediary, or wicked cannot be based on actions. Because if they're based on actions, then it makes no sense, because 50% sins won't make you intermediary. So it must be, we need to now examine a deeper part of the soul to be able to define what does it mean intermediary. So we have to look inward, and that's what we're about to do. So that's the first point, and now we're going to go to the second point, second half, which is in content, it's smaller, but the ideas are revolutionary. So we're going to try to make a dash for it, and maybe even try to finish the entire chapter inside. Who knows? Okay. Back to business. The next thing we're going to say, we're going to quote a Kabbalistic text, the Arizal. Arizal is the 16th century great Kabbalist from Tzfat. He was really the foundation of what they would call later the Rihanna Kabbalah, because his name was Ari, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria. And a lot of Kabbalistic principles, a lot of Hasidic principles are based on the Kabbalah of the Ari. He is basically considered the greatest Kabbalist of all times. In other words, what he says, he's accepted as the primary source. He himself did not write any books. The books were written by his student, Rabbi Chaim Vital, in multiple books. The one we're going to quote is called Eitz Chaim, the Tree of Life. So again, Rabbi Shneur Zalman in the beginning says, I'm collecting from other sources. Not everything here is original. Of course, it is radical and original the way he sets it out and the way he explains it. But we have a source a previous source that explains what this big idea of everybody has two souls. Here we go. However, the explanation of the matter, so that we better understand the levels of tzaddik and Beinoni, righteous and intermediary, as well as the various gradations within their ranks. This is found in the light of Rabbi Chaim Vital, wrote in Shar HaKadusha, the Gate of Holiness, and in Eitz Chaim, Portal 50, Chapter 2. Okay, this is a big idea. Every Jew, whether righteous or wicked, possesses two souls, as it is written, and nishamot, souls which I have made. So we quote a verse. It doesn't say I made a soul, I made your soul. I have two souls. Everybody has two souls. There's two personalities. There's not one person within you, there are two. These are the two nefashot, two souls and life forces. Okay, what are the two life forces? What we're going to do now, chapter 1, we're going to talk about the first one. And chapter 2, we talk about the second soul. Now, basically, what we're going to say is that the first soul, we're going to call it the animal soul, but really it's the natural soul. And the natural soul comes from what we call kalipa and sitra achara, which literally means the peel and the other side, the side that is not holy. Now, make no mistake, it doesn't mean that it's evil. The animal soul is not evil, but we're going to define these terms of what does unholiness mean, what is not holy, what is the klipa, the peel on the other side. We're going to actually define those terms not here, but in chapter 6. But in any case, what we're going to say, it's not holy and it's natural. And that's the source of most of the person's, of many of the person's desires and many of the person's qualities, both negative as well as positive. That's very interesting. The animal soul is not evil. It's got negative qualities and positive qualities. What it is natural. Okay, so we begin the journey. One soul originates in the klipa and sitra achra. Okay, the peel and the other side. In other words, it's not holy. We'll get to those terms later in chapter 6. This is the nefesh, the soul, which originates in the klipa and sitra achra, that is clothed in the blood of a human being, given life to the body. So the animal soul gives the body vitality, gives the body life. As it is written, for the nefesh. Nefesh is another word for soul. In Hebrew, there are many words for soul. There's nefesh, ruh, neshama. There's different words. Here we're going to call it nefesh. The nefesh of the flesh, i.e. the nefesh that sustains physical and corporal life, is in the blood. Okay. So we have an animal soul. The animal soul, what do we know so far? They have an animal soul. We call it one soul. Later we'll get back to that. We'll call it the animal soul. But right now we're going to call it the first soul. What do we know about the first soul? First thing we know, it gives the life, it gives the body life. That's the first thing we know. Now we're going to say, from this nefesh stems all evil characteristics deriving from the four evil elements within it. Okay, evil is a bad translation. Ra, evil is a bad translation. Okay, negative. From this nefesh stems all the negative characteristics deriving from the four negative elements within it. Later, we're going to say that this soul also has positive elements. But right now, we're starting the negative elements. Now, there's four elements. There's fire, there's water, there is wind, and there is earth. That was the early philosophers discussed these four elements. The Greeks discussed these four elements. So we have four elements. And we're going to say, spiritually speaking, the soul also has four elements. And what we're going to do now is we're going to show how various negative traits come from these four elements. And here we go. Dahainu, namely, anger and pride emanate from the element of fire, which rises upward, right? Anger, when a person is angry, of course, they're burning like a fire. Pride means I lift myself up. That's like fire, the fire goes upward, defying gravity. So that's anger and pride. These are negative emotions. The appetite for pleasure emanates from the element of water, for water promotes the growth of all kinds of pleasurable things. So pleasure is associated with water. Frivolity and scoffing, boasting and idle talk emanate from the element of ear. Like ear, they lack substance. And sloth and melancholy sadness and melancholy emanate from the element of earth. It's like heavy. Okay, so what do we have here? We have here, what is the animal soul? The animal soul tells you, if the animal soul gives life to the body, soul number one gives life to the body, and is also the source of all negative traits within a person. However, it's not only the source of the negative traits, it's also the source of the positive traits of a person. Here, he says the Jewish soul, and later he's going to say the Gentile soul doesn't have that, but we have to read that with a grain of salt, so bear with me, please. From this soul stems also the good traits inherent in every Jew's character, such as compassion and benevolence. How does a soul that's unholy have compassion and benevolence? So, Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, for in the case of the Jew, the soul of Kalipa is derived from the Kalipa called Noga, which also contains good. And the good within the Nefesh gives rise to these positive natural traits. We'll see later in chapter 6 and 7, it discusses there are two types of Klipot. There's two types of unholiness. There's the three Klipot, unholiness of light as in illumination. There's light in there. And then there's negativity that has no light at all. So what we're saying is the Jewish soul it's not holy, but just because it's not holy doesn't mean it doesn't have good, because it comes from the level of Kalipa, the unholiness that has both positive and negative. Now, this is related to the mystical concept. This Kalipa is derived from the esoteric tree of knowledge, which is comprised of good and evil. Okay, so what happens here? If you look at the story of the Garden of Eden, you see that there's a tree of knowledge of good and evil. So mystically speaking, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, there's so many ways to understand that story, but mystically speaking, the tree of knowledge of good and evil is a soul, it means that it's unholiness, but make no mistake, it also has good. So the first soul, while the first soul gives rise to many of the positive traits, to all the negative traits of the person, as listed earlier, it also is the source of the positive traits that are natural within the person, which is, for example, compassion and benevolence and doing good for somebody else. Why? Because even though it's not holy, but it's the Klipa that has both holiness and unholiness. That's the end of this section. Now we have a few lines left where Rabbi Shneur Zalman talks about the souls of the Gentiles, which seems to be very negative. So I'm going to give a little introduction, then I'm going to read it, and then we're going to come back. You know what? Let's read it first. You ready? You've got to be careful. I'm giving you a trigger warning. This may offend some people. Okay. The souls of the nations of the world, however, emanate from the other unclean klipot, which contain no good whatsoever. Okay, so we said the Jewish soul has both good and evil. the soul of the nations of the world have no evil, have no good whatsoever. As it is written in Eitz Chaim, Portal 49, chapter 3, that all the good that the nations do is done out of selfish motives. So the Gemara comments on the verse, the kindness of the nations is sin, that all the charity and kindness done by the nations of the world is only for their self-glorification, hulu, etc. Okay, what's happening here? So we have to deal with this issue of how we deal with the Gentiles. What is Rabbi Shneur Zalman saying about the Gentiles? And then we get back to just to make the big picture of chapter 1 and what we have learned now over what we knew 45 minutes ago or 43 minutes ago. So let's deal with the Gentiles for a moment. You need a few caveats to what Rabbi Shneur Zalman is saying. Rabbi Shneur Zalman is saying, first of all, he's quoting the Talmud. So to understand what he's saying, you have to look at the Talmud. And the Talmud says that there are what the Talmud calls Chasidei Umot HaOlam, the righteous Gentiles. And the righteous Gentiles are considered just like the Jews in the sense that they have good within their soul. Naturally. So we're talking about in 2020 or 2021, that's majority of the population of the world we would consider, for this purpose of this discussion, righteous Gentiles, Chasidei Umot HaOlam, who naturally have good. Then he says there's a class of people who have a soul. They don't have any good. They have an animal soul. They don't have any good in the animal soul. Their animal soul has no good. What does it mean that animal soul has no good? It means naturally it has no good. They can learn how to become good, but naturally they have no good. Now, are we saying they're evil? No. And this is a very important point. When we say that the natural soul has good, the natural soul that has good, the Jewish soul and the souls of the righteous of the nations of the world, have the good human beings, have good within their natural soul. What do you mean by good? Good, I don't mean only that a person is compassionate, that a person does kindness, right? That's not good by this definition. That's not what we call good. Why not? Because the definition of good here is putting somebody else before myself. If I am doing good because it makes me feel good, is that good? So, but the Talmud says, no, that's not good. You're doing it for ulterior motive. If I'm doing good because it makes me feel good, I would buy you a plaque because you're a good person. But the Talmud implies that's not good. You're just making yourself feel good. So some people feel good by going on a cruise. Some people feel good by playing golf, and some people feel good by writing a check to charity. That's not what we mean by good. What we mean by good is the ability to transcend self and connect to somebody else and putting the other person before self. In other words, the other person's need is more important to me than my own need. That's compassion. That's kindness from the perspective of what we're going to call here good. So when I say that there are some people whose animal soul has no good at all, you have to understand that first of all, it's a group of people. It's not everybody. Number two, when I say they have no good at all, it doesn't mean they can't become good. It means that naturally they don't have that good. And what don't they have? It's not what the conventional definition of good. They're good people by the Webster Dictionary's definition. When we say they don't have good, it means that they don't have the ability to sense the other person's pain more than their own. To realize that the other person has a greater need than self. In other words, the natural soul is here to make me survive, to make me thrive, to protect myself. It's not here for transcendence. The natural soul is the parts of me that want me to take care of myself. That's the natural soul. There's a strange phenomenon that within the natural soul of some people, there is also a good. In other words, even the soul that makes me feel, that wants to protect myself and wants me to survive, that soul within itself can also sometimes feel the other person's pain more than mine. That's a strange thing because it's not natural to the soul. Yes, but some natural souls have that as well. But that's not the second soul. The second soul is going to be a godly soul, which we'll learn about in chapter 2, which is a completely different story. And that's the conclusion of chapter 1. We read the entire chapter inside. Wow, amazing. So what do we have? What do we have? What's the conclusion? What do we know now that we didn't know earlier? So what we learned is, first of all, we have to look inward. We want to define and understand what's happening within ourselves. We can't just look at what we do, because that's too external. We want to really get a hold, an understanding of what is happening within our own soul, within our desires, within our own inner life. That's one thing we want to do. That's one thing we learned. And what we're saying here is that understand that person has multiple, at least two souls within themselves, multiple personalities. And by understanding these two personalities, we'll understand everything else will fall into place. So that's enough for today. We don't have enough to start explaining what to do with this information. You have to come back for the future weeks. But that is what we have so far. But what I will say is as follows. A lot of what happens here, we read last week, people came to Rabbi Shneur Zalman and they said, we have a problem. We have a problem in our service of God. And everybody's coming with the same problem. Everyone's coming with different problems. But we said last week, from Rabbi Shneur Zalman's perspective, he says, it's all the same problem. So let me write a book that will solve all the problems. Not solve, deal with all the problems. So what was the problems that these people were dealing with? So we're dealing here with people who, sometimes for decades, are working on personal growth and trying to make themselves better people. And then they're not 13 years old. They've been working on this for decades. And then they wake up one day when they're 40 or 50 or 60, or it doesn't matter when. And they have a midlife crisis in the sense that they look at themselves and they say, okay, I've done a lot of good deeds. I studied a lot of Torah. I gave a lot of charity. I followed all the rules in the book. It's wonderful. But I look at myself and I sense negative desires within myself. So how could it be that after decades of trying to refine myself, I wake up in the morning and I have a negative desire? That's the problem. And what's their interpretation? Their interpretation means that must mean that all the effort that I'm putting in to the study of Torah and to self-refinement is false. It's not genuine. It's not authentic. It's not really doing anything. Because if I would actually be affecting myself, how could I wake up decades later with negative desires within my heart? And these people were in pain. And they came to Rabbi Shneur Zalman. And they said, what are we going to do? We're wasting our time. We're working so hard and we're seeing no results. In what sense are we seeing no results? Not that they're not good people. They're very good people. They're going and they're doing good things and they're studying Torah and they're scholars and they're kind and they're doing all the mitzvot and they're following all the commandments in the book. But they say, that's what we're doing. What about the state of our soul? Within myself, I sense the negativity. And they come to Rabbi Shneur Zalman, and Rabbi Shneur Zalman has to heal this. And the first step of healing is understanding that it's not one soul, it's two souls. And therefore, as he's going to say later in chapter 28, so you see, it's got to read the whole book. As he's going to say later in chapter 28, what he's going to say is, 1 second, take it easy, relax. You are never, if you're an intermediary person, you're never going to rid your soul of the animal soul. You're never going to rid yourself of the negative desire. That's not happening unless you're righteous. But this book is not for righteous people. Righteous people are very few. So the fact that you have negative desires is not because the good part, you're praying and you're studying and you're doing good deeds is disingenuous and is not authentic. No, because that's the other motivation within yourself. That's the godly soul. And the fact that you have an animal soul does not negate from the fact that you have a godly soul. So what this does, this doctrine of the two souls, what it's going to do amongst many other things, what it's going to do is going to try to help the people understand, don't try to get rid, don't be disappointed. First of all, don't try. Second of all, don't be disappointed when it doesn't happen. Don't try to get rid of your evil within yourself. It's an impossibility for the intermediary person. And therefore, don't get disappointed if after decades of trying to be a good person, I wake up in the morning and have a negative desire. That says nothing about the value of what you're doing. All that says is that you're not righteous. All that says is that you're in Bainani, you're an intermediary person. All that says is you have an animal soul. And the animal soul has negative traits. It also has positive traits, but it also has negative traits. And there's nothing you can do about it. You also have a godly soul. And now what we're going to do is once we introduce what the godly soul is, then we introduce the capacities of both the godly soul in chapter 3 and chapter 4, and chapter 5 is sort of a bracket. Then chapter 6, we start analyzing the animal soul. And finally, in chapter 9, we start dealing with the battle between the animal soul and the godly soul. And what we're going to say is all tension within self comes from this battle. And then we have to manage the battle. But we're never going to rid ourselves, for Beinoni, we're never going to rid ourselves of the godly soul, of the animal soul. And therefore, if you're trying to, number one, you're climbing up the wrong tree. Number two, you're trying to achieve a disappointment. Number three, you're never going to do it. And number four, you're going to be depressed because you're going to feel that all your efforts are wasted. So that is sort of this is sort of the big change that happens here when you introduce the concept of two souls. It makes you make peace. I don't want to say peace. It makes you embrace the fact that there's negativity within yourself. And there's nothing wrong with that. The fact that I have negativity within myself is nothing wrong. Later, we'll see how to manage that and what to do with that negativity. But I'm never going to rid myself of that negativity. Why? Because I'm a Beinoni. What does a Beinoni mean? A Beinoni means I'm intermediary. I'm not wicked. We'll deal with wicked later. I'm not wicked, but I have both those souls. Therefore, I am not righteous, because the righteous person is one who has no negative, he has no animal soul. He's got no negative inclination. There's no evil within himself. Nothing within himself wants to do things that are evil and destructive. Now let's go back to Rabbah. Rabbah says, Rabbah, the greatest Talmudic sage of his time, Rabbah says, I am an intermediary person. Could Rabbah, well, we believe he was righteous, but that's beside the point. Could Rabbah believe that he's intermediary, even though he did only good deeds? Yeah. Because by this definition, intermediary has nothing to do with what you do. Righteousness means you have no evil within your heart at all. And that's a very high bar. And a person can make a mistake in his evaluation of self. But if a Beinoni means 50% sins, there's no way in the world that Rabbah could have that, could make that mistake. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is a story in short. It's a little incomplete because we're only starting the journey. There's a lot more to do. Like I said, before we even get to chapter 12, we need to get, just to understand the full picture, we have to get to chapter 12, which will take us, God willing, only 3 months. So that's good. We'll try to do a chapter a week. So thank you all for joining. We'll take questions. Vicky, please go ahead, and then Bob. And have a wonderful day, wonderful Shabbat. Anyone who needs to go off can go off now. We're ready overtime, but go ahead.
Thank you, Rabbi. I had a couple of questions about definitions. So first question is the natural soul, does it apply only to nefesh or ruach? It doesn't have that. That's my first question. Second question is what is the definition of negativity? And the third is Rabbi Pinson says that the soul is experiencer of life. So which soul is an experiencer?
Okay, so let's start with the easiest one. Number two, you asked, I'm totally confused. Number two,
what is negativity? What is
negativity? That question will be answered in chapter 6. I'll tell you what negativity is not. In other words, negativity is not holiness. For the purpose of our discussion, negative means not holy. In other words, what we're saying, negative means not holy, means non-transcendent. So for our discussion, that's why negative is a negative word. The only place we saw negative is a tricky word. The only place we saw negative in this chapter was that the animal soul, which is not negative, has negative traits. What are those negative traits? Anger, boasting, indulging in too much pleasure, sadness. These are negative traits. So the purpose of our discussion, I think when we say negative, when you say negative traits, these are what we would conventionally call bad. But
negative emotions, in other words.
Emotion, correct. Now, when we say the animal soul, we don't say the animal soul is negative. What we say is that the animal soul is from the klipa and sitra achra, from the peel and the other side. It's not holy. What does it mean to be not holy? We can't fully. We don't have the picture yet until chapter 6. But again, so far, what do we know? So far, we know that I have one soul. The first soul, I have two souls. The first soul is the natural soul. Now, going back to your first question, So far we say nefesh. We call it nefesh. Nefesh is the lowest form of the soul. So I think when we talk about the animal soul, we talk about nefesh. When we talk about the godly soul, next week, we're also going to use the term nefesh, but obviously that nefesh has other levels as well. So for the purpose of our discussion, at least the animal soul has nefesh. Specifically, it has all of them. In other words, it depends how you want to classify. Ultimately, it's beyond the scope of this discussion, but ultimately, nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya, yechido, all those 5 levels exist in the animal soul as well, with the exception of the fifth element. The animal soul has nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya, and the godly soul has all 5, because the part that gives life to the physical body is nefesh. The part that gives life to the emotions is ruach. Neshama is intelligence. Chaya is will and pleasure. So they all have all 3. They all have all 4, and the godly soul has 5. But primarily, we're using the term nefesh right now. So that's again. I don't want to get too much into this, but they all have multiple levels. The godly
and Tanya goes into that. It's all explained in Tanya later, right?
Later, not all in the first section of the 53 chapters. Some of it comes later. Yeah, but it's everywhere. Yeah.
Can you just say that real quickly again, where you said nefesh related to body? What were those?
So it's I don't want to get into it right now because it's technical, but I'm happy to say it. I'm happy to say it. Nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya is the 4 levels of the soul. Then there's yechida. Yechida means the singular. So the Kabbalah explains that why the 5 names to the soul? Because there's different dimensions within the soul. Nefesh would be the lowest dimension. You can either call nefesh to the part that gives life to the body, physical life, or you could say nefesh is what controls the external faculties, like speech and action. And then you get to the concept of ruach. Ruach is spirit, and ruach is the emotions. And then you get to neshama, which is a higher name, and neshama is intelligence. And then chaya, which means life. Chaya is the will and the pleasure. And then you have the godly soul has yechida, which means the singular, because it's bound up with the singular God. But that's another story.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
And as far as experience, I guess I need to address it with Rabbi Pinson.
Yeah, and I think if you're talking about the experiencing physical world, you're going to have primarily the animal soul. Even though the godly soul, of course, experiences godliness. But so yeah, maybe we need more information for that. Go ahead, Bob, please.
Firstly, let me congratulate you on actually finishing a chapter in a session. It's so unusual. It's unusual for me to see that. Anyway,
thank you.
I'm just a little troubled by the last few lines. Am I mistaken to think that this is one of the uncharacteristic few times where we're actually pulling rank? We're declaring our own superiority to the goyim. I mean, it doesn't sound Jewish. It sounds. Usually we're here as equals, but we got more work to do. Right. Here it's sort of saying that we're somehow better than anybody else and enlightened.
Correct. So let's deal with this for a second. Let's do it. Like I said, let's do it. First, I want to say that a lot of people, when they criticize the Tanya, they quote these lines in Tanya. Of course, this guy's, you can't really blame Rabbi Shneur Zalman for it because it's just a quote from the Talmud and a quote from the Arizal. So he's dealing with the sources and he's just explaining them in the context of the sources that already exist. But are we really pulling rank over other people? Are we saying we're better? The short answer is no. The short answer is based on the way the Rebbe taught us how to read the Tanya and how to explain the Tanya. The short answer is no, because if you're saying it's a Jew-Gentile matter, then you're right, and you're saying any Gentile does not have any good within themselves, as the Talmud may imply, then that would be what you call pulling rank. What we're saying is that there are not a few, but there's the within the souls of the human beings that are not Jewish, there are Hasidim, there are people that have kindness within themselves. So what we're saying is this is not a Jewish thing. What we're saying is that this is universal. It happens to be that there are some human beings that naturally are not born with any transcendence. They're born with a desire to do good in the conventional sense of good, which is I'm doing good because it makes me feel good. So there are some people that don't have what our definition of good. There are some people, but we're not necessarily saying that only Jews have it, and we're not saying that the majority of Gentiles do not have it. So it's not a question of pulling rank. What we are saying is that every Jewish soul is going to have the good within it. That's what we are saying, I think. So I don't know if this will fully make us feel good. I don't know, but this is the way we were. Again, like I said, we're dealing here with the sources. The sources is Talmudic, and the Talmud says that when some Gentiles, when they do good, they're doing it to make them do themselves for an ulterior motive. Now, let's not. So that's. I hope this at least alleviates some of the discomfort. In other words, it's not just the Jews. Okay. If you go to any psychology in the department in any university, I think I'm not a scholar, but if you do, when you ask them, is a person's primary motivation self-preservation? Is it true that when a person does good, it's really is only doing it for their own self? My guess is that they will tell you yes. In other words, my guess is that they agree with what the Talmud is saying, that when people do good, they're doing it for themselves, right? And that's what most people experience. What we're saying here is, one second. So what psychology would tell you is the conventional understanding. We're saying some souls, Jewish and many non-Jewish, have more than that. They have the ability to do good at their own expense. They have the ability to do good not because it makes them feel good, but because the other person's need is placed before them. So what I've just said, I think I'm saying two things. Number one, I'm saying what seems when you read the Talmud seems to be so negative against humanity is not so negative. That's the conventional interpretation of psychology today, as far as I can tell. But regarding your question, I was saying that there's something more. The soul has something more within itself than that. Forget about the godly soul. Even the animal soul has more than that within it. Is it exclusive to Jews? The answer is a resounding no. It's not exclusive to Jews.
Thank you, Rabbi.
This is the best I can do based on what it says in the book. Yeah.
Rabbi,
Yes.
this may be too much, so just tell me. You mentioned about the different categories of the tzaddik and the rasha. Can you say a
Yes.
little bit more?
So we're going to get to that. The categories of a tzaddik is in chapter 10. The category of a rasha is chapter 11.
Okay. Thank
So
you.
it's like I said, we really, you don't even, to understand what's happening here, you have to read the first 12 chapters. Then we'll get to the rest of the book. But just to get, even just to put down the definitions will take us some time.
Thank you.
Okay.
Shabbat shalom, Rabbi.
Shabbat shalom. Shabbat shalom. Be well.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Rabbi, can I have one more question?
Yes, of course.
Just quick follow-up. Regarding the being transcendent and putting other people's interests first, can it be in a conflict with the need of the person and because if I'm not for myself, so why is it a virtue? So I'm still struggling with definition of what is good, what is evil within.
I'm not saying what I should do. If I have $1, if I'm in the desert and I have one piece of bread, and it's either I'm going to die or my friend is going to die, I'm not talking about what I should do. What I should do, I have to follow the law. And the law says, save yourself first. Okay? So I'm not talking about what I should do. Should I give somebody else on my expense? I'm not talking about what I should do. You have to do so. It depends. The answer is it depends, right? But you have to protect yourself first. There's no question about that. But I'm not talking about what I should do. I'm talking about how I feel. The good person, in our understanding, the good is the ability to transcend. The good person says the other person's need could be maybe even greater than mine. The natural soul, without the good, will never feel that, because the purpose of the natural soul is self-preservation. So it's not interested in the other person. But the good part, the light in the klipat noga and the klipa of light, the light has the ability of spirituality, of goodness, of transcendence. It says the other person is hungry. The other person is more. The good within me feels that the other person could be more deserving than I. Now, whether or not I give my last piece of bread is a technical question. In other words, that's not a question of how I feel. That's a question of what I should do. And sometimes the answer is I keep it for myself. But even when I do, there's something in my soul that wants to do good. I want to give. I want to give. I'm in pain. I want to give.
So is that what you're saying? It's the time where tzaddikim struggle when they have to give, they have to take something and not to another person or something like.
That's a good question. I know that's a good question. Sometimes, yeah, I guess sometimes you have to go against the desire to do good, because sometimes, right, Judaism is about balance and about the law, and sometimes you want to do good, but now the good is not what's demanded.
Yeah, so in the areas when you actually pull to put other interests first, sometimes you have to struggle to do within the reasonable limits.
Right. Let me put it to you this way. A guy is in the desert and he has one piece of bread or one jug of water. If he gives it to the other person he'll die. If he drinks it himself, the other person will die. The halacha says you have to drink it yourself. That's the law. Okay? Why am I drinking it myself? Because I want to? No, then I'm not good. I'm drinking it myself because that's what Torah says. Then I'm good. Right?
And then he will have the survivor guilt for the rest of his life.
No, it's no survival guilt because I'm doing it because God told me to do so.
Okay.
Right? It's only survival guilt if I put myself before the other person. But if naturally I want to I want to give it to the other person.
Thank you.
I'm keeping it myself because because that's the divine will. So I submit to the divine will. So when I'm drinking my water, it's not a selfish act. I could drink the water myself as a selfish act, but then I could drink the water because that's the divine will. Okay, a lot more to say. 52 chapters more to go. So we'll see you at the next train stop next week.
Thank you. Good Shabbos.
Thank you. Wonderful Shabbos.
Shabbat shalom.
Shalom.